title of my lecture, I'd like to add to it a phrase from one of Padraig Colum's poems that in some ways sums up Padraig Colum, the man and the work. I can perhaps do no better than to call my talk tonight Homely Grandeur, Padraig Colum and the Drama of Storytelling. Colum's career was vast in scope. His first plays and poems began to be published and performed in around 1902, and his last work, the poignant and poignantly named volume of poetry, Images of Departure, which is really one of his finest volumes of poetry, was published in 1969 when Colum was 87 years old. During these 67 productive years, Colum participated in the great awakening of Irish literature with which the century opened, particularly the rise of the Irish theatre. His plays were among the first, and the first acclaimed peasant plays to be performed at the Abbey. And his poetic gift led some to call him a genius, that was A.E. actually, and to prophesy that he would be the next Yeats. His versatility was also astonishing. I can't think of a genre of literature that Padraig Colum did not try his hand at. He was variously a playwright, a poet, a novelist, a children's writer, in all of which guises he produced works of distinction, as well as an essayist, memoirist, biographer, travel writer, and critic of note. And I have a feeling I've left out a few things, but they just don't come to mind, but that seems to cover about everything. By the time of his death, at age 90 in 1972, he had produced no fewer than 70 books, substantial contributions to 75 more, and articles, stories, and poems published in magazines that would bring the total into 4 figures. So the task of assessing his work has its challenges. There is a grandeur, then, in the achievement, diversity, and scope of Colum's work. But Colum was, in several senses of the word, a homely writer as well. He wrote of home people and home truths, the life of the lowly peasant in all of its complexities, its nobility and its meanness, its poetry and its poverty, its warmth and also its oppression in the politically troubled times of his youth, for instance, when farmers still did not own their own land, still had to show subservience, as one of the characters in Colum's play The Land says, not only to the landlord, but to the landlord's dog boy, still had to suppress speech and to fear harassment, arrest, and even hanging, and still were taught to scorn their history and their culture. It was these people whom Colum placed on the stage at the Abbey Theatre. He gave them voice in poems that he put in their mouths, and in stories in children's books that showed their characters and retold their stories. Colum's work is homely, then, in its attention to domestic life and common things, in its unpretentiousness and simplicity, in its friendliness to the sympathetic reader, and also in the personal humility and unassuming good humor of its creator. George Russell, A.E. again, once told Frank O'Connor that Padraig Colum was the only Irish writer who didn't have a pain in his belly. And Arnold Bax, I think Frank O'Connor was a little annoyed at that, perhaps. Arnold Bax, who was an English composer who knew Colum, called Colum the friendliest soul on earth, the purest and most generous nature I ever had the good luck to encounter. To hear a malicious word about anyone, he goes on to say, even though thoroughly deserved, was positive pain to him, and he should have served as a perpetual reproof to tattling Dublin, where the acoustics have always been so perfect. A line itself that tells us something. In character as well as subject matter, then, Colum preserved the kind of holiness that itself might well be called a grandeur. How Colum came to identify himself with the peasantry and to define his poetic vocation in terms of them is laid out for us in a poem called the four-piece to the poet's circuit. And what I'd like to put on the overhead now, that obviously was column up there, is a cover to the second edition of this poem. The Poet's Circuit is a group of poems, and mainly Column's old poems from several decades. One of them is one which has become popular as a song, She Moved Through the Fair. And this illustration on this cover is a Jack Yates drawing in watercolor that illustrates that song, She Moved Through the Fair. The four-piece was a new poem, and in it, Colum describes how he came to write poetry. One of the striking images that he puts for us is of a country woman with whom he's staying, stitching a quilt together before the fire. This quilt is made of red and black patches, and as she sews it, the woman is using little pieces of paper from a basket by her to lift up patches of the cloth, and she's tufting it so that she's actually sewing these pieces of paper in underneath the red and black patches. Now this for Colum became an image, or he used it as an image that becomes a vivid and I think deeply felt metaphor for an art which, like Colum's own, is rooted in the lives of these people. The patch of red, for instance, he saw it when he looked at the huntsmen massed together with their red coats in a field ready for the hunt. These would be men of the landlord class, whose privileges, of course, came at the expense of the common Irish people whose land is not their own. The patch of black, and this wouldn't work on Prince Edward Island, is the plowed field. The plowed field of Colum's friend and mentor, whom he here calls Owen Perlon, his country host. And it's a place where Owen Perlon sweats and labors and refreshes himself at lunchtime with a plowman's lunch, which is not, as in some restaurants, made of cheese and meats, but it is of oat cakes with butter that was laid as deep as they were thick, and drops of buttermilk, then watercress gathered from a nearby pool. On the little scraps of paper, Colum sees lines made by a quill, he writes, and he saw they were in Latin and knew them Virgil's by their poetry, although they were about the bulls and cows, their mating, and the cleaning of their byres. So remnants of the classical learning, which was preserved in the cottages by hedge schoolmasters when formal schooling was forbidden to Catholics, are thus being worked into this quilt, as are fragments of other kinds of writings, street ballads, for instance, which commemorate Irish heroes. And here Colum is thinking not so much of the great folk heroes, but of the lads who have been resisting the British and who have been arrested and imprisoned and sometimes even hanged. In addition, there are also fragments of a kind of song which he says is more personal, which I take to be love poetry. So all of this is being sewn into this quilt. And finally, this quilt that represents the field and the house, the Irish peasant and the landlord, the struggle, the lost learning, and the private loves, all of this is being stitched together with strokes that seem to Colum, he says, like a turn in verse, so very rhythmic and methodical. This quilt is what Colum calls a homely grandeur. This homemade but carefully constructed work of art has a lot to say, I think, about Colum's own art. Now, I would like to consider and read a section from the end of the poem where Colum turns to his own writing. And, let's always look at the thing before you. The mysterious thing about these overhead projectors is that at the top they're out of focus and at the bottom they're in. I think that maybe actually the piece itself is a little curved, but anyway, I'll push it up later on. So in this episode, Colum is visiting his friends on another occasion besides the first one when he saw the quilt. And he has been spending the evening with Owen Perlon and his wife Johanna and their neighbors. And then he talks about after they have gone home, the neighbors. He says, and later, when the neighbors had gone home, and my two friends had left me for their bed, I still kept place beside the covered fire. I was alone. Yet there were people with me, men and women who had abodes, who had a history, and work and humors, and the moiety of poetry, tradition, keeps in trust. And I could hear, the door being open, certain birds that flew between the clouds and bog, and I could hear the cattle moving in the byre, the horses stirring in their short sleeps, and while I sat, my mind took to itself a murmuring, and there were words that it was fitted to, words that turned in furrows or in verses, and took a shape, and went with certainty among surprises, and became a poem. Now, I think there are several things that we can notice in this first bit of the end. First of all, the people who are with him, I think, are the people who have just gone to bed, the neighbors and the hosts, and, of course, stretching back to them in history, the country people in general. He sees them as having abodes that is being rooted in a place because he himself feels rootless. Now, at this time, Colum was living in Dublin. He'd gone to Dublin at the age of 17 by himself to work. His mother had died, and his father had been unable to keep a job, so he had, I think, 7 siblings to support in the countryside. But he felt rootless there, and he admired the settlement of these people. And he also admired their simple life, their honest work, but saw again in them the interest of their character. He also was interested in the fact that there still was a remnant of the traditional learning, a care for poetry and for imaginative things among these people. Another thing that I like to notice in this poem is that Colum is very sensitive to the natural environment as well. So although he's sitting in the cottage, in the home, he is looking out the door at the clouds and the bog and noticing the birds as they flit between the earthly and the spiritual, perhaps, in some sense. And meanwhile, he's also sensitive to the animals that are in the barn, the cows and the horses. These are all materials that come into Colum's poetry and his plays and his fiction later on. But most striking for me is the part about the murmuring that becomes verse. And the turn of the verse is like the stitching that we read about earlier, but also like the turn in furrows, like plowing. So truly, he's connecting his verse making with the rhythms of this common life. Colum goes on to say in the part that I didn't put on the overhead that he told his poem to Owen Perlon the next day, who made much of it and more of me, he says. And, oh, well, heavens, Colum never wrote anything as crooked as that. Out of this one poem, he says, other poems grew until it became his vocation. And he says he did not forget to prove his poetry by going out among the country people and telling them the poems. And this is a nice thing, too, because the poems come from the people, but they also go back to the people. And this is how he closes the poem. I should say that the idea of the poet circuits refers to the medieval poet who really did have a profession as a poet and who would occasionally go from his own region out into the other regions, making a circuit and showing off his poetry and getting together with other poets and learning from them. So Colum here is applying this idea to his own wanderings. So in the springtime, he says, I would close a circuit and go between the hedgerows when the winds were golden, and would come to where the crows fed their discordant broods, and go within Owen Perlon's, and to a company whose minds the words enlivened as the turf down breaking made a kindling in the ash. I told my poems, and as they say in stories, the ford I found, they found the stepping stones. Again, I think it's striking that he feels that he's connecting with the minds of these people, and he doesn't say that when he told his poems that the poem itself was a revelation to them, but rather he puts it into their minds. It's their minds that are active and capable of kindling to poetry and that care for imaginative things. This last line, the ford I found, they found the stepping stones, itself is something that Collins draws from, as he says here, the storytelling tradition. It would be partly nonsense in the sense that it's not connected to the main story or the main poem. But it gives me here the sense that together, Colum and his audience are perhaps fording the same river, crossing the same stream. And they cross in different ways, but they do both get to the other side by the vehicle of this poem. It does one thing for Colum and something else for his audience, but it carries both of them along in the direction that they want to go. Okay, only 2.5 hours to go. Now, at this point, we should maybe take a look at what happened to the poetic career that Colum started when he was in the countryside. Now, whoa, this is going to be awkward. What I've done here is divided Colum's work into the main genres of it. And I do this not, a brand new pen. Well, let's try another color. Does that show up? It's one thing I forgot to check. Okay. We have the plays, the poetry, and the fiction. And what I want to do here, the reason I made this diagram is not really to try to cover all these works, but rather to show you an interesting pattern. Colum, as I say, moved to Dublin in just around 1899. And what we notice is that he started writing the early short plays that he would offer to people and publish in magazines. And also, he started publishing poems at about the same time. But Dublin in those days was the place of an active theater that was just about to emerge. And Colum, having his poetic gift and his interest in the country people in Dublin at that time, found himself very heavily involved in the drama. So that in these 10 years, he did a lot of work in the drama. Now, a lot of it is like stuff that we can just consider as juvenilia. That is, oh, what a terrible looking pen. But some of these plays are things that are notable. The Broken Soil in 1903 is one of his major works. I guess I'll go with pink. And The Land and Thomas Muskerry. Now these are the three of his plays that were produced at the Abbey. And he had various other little things going. The Broken Soil became rewritten at the Fiddler's House and improved. Okay. A curious thing happened to Colum here. He wrote two plays that were not set in Ireland. One of them is The Desert, and the other one is Theodora, or Theodora of the Byzantium. And as you can see from further down the list, in later years, I don't have any other plays down. Now, it's not that he wasn't working on drama. He was working and working on The Desert and Theodora. And he went through at least 4 titles with his play, The Desert, and countless versions of it. Yet it never had the success that he hoped for. And in all this time, the only new play he produced was this play, Balloon, and some adaptations of other things. So that you can see that his career in the theater changed drastically after about this point. This was his last Abbey play. And notice here, he emigrated to America in 1914, so that has something to do with it. Now, the poetry, on the other hand, is much more consistent. It's spaced out, but it continues, except for one gap later on, more or less throughout his career. And the volume that really made his fame, and many people think that it is as a poet that Colum made his greatest contribution, is Wild Earth, which contains dramatic monologues. Now, in contrast to drama, what happens in fiction is quite interesting. He didn't write fiction from the very start. Then he started to write a few stories. He wrote a children's book in 1913, and then after he was in America, another one, The King of Ireland's Son, which I would also circle as one of the key words. And after that, he got a children's book contract with Macmillan to produce 2 books a year. I don't think he quite did 2 books a year, but you can see one after the other, and there are 15 more besides, so that his creative energies were taken up for much of the last, this isn't even the last part of his life, but for much of the later part of his life with writing these children's books. And he also produced a couple of novels which are completely overlooked, but have considerable interest, particularly the last one, The Flying Swans. This is also to neglect the very last period, because as I mentioned before, Colum kept writing, and some of his last works, in the last 15 years, he really produced, I think, what are some of his most compelling and greatest works. But we can't do everything even in 3 hours, so we're going to leave those aside. It's interesting to have a little glimpse at Colum's working methods. William Fay used to report that Colum, who was working in the railway clearinghouse, used to come into the theater after rehearsals or before rehearsals with his pockets full of little pieces of paper. I don't know if he was thinking of these when he talked about the paper that went into making that quilt, but they would have the pieces that he'd written during the day in odd moments of whatever play he was working on, on various little pieces of paper. So he'd take them out and he'd say, I've got a lot more here. And he'd say, well, now this one I think goes in no, it's not Act 2, it's Act 1. And then he'd take out a little blue square and a little yellow triangle and say, well, I think this one comes next. And so it took a lot of patience to work out just what the manuscript was supposed to be. But William Fay also says that he learned quickly. As a figure, he, I think, must have been quite striking in his own way. Joseph Holloway tells us about Colum taking a curtain call after his play The Land in 1905 was produced, and it was one of the first plays that was really acclaimed both popularly and by the critics. Now, we should notice that Colum would have been all of 23 years old at that time, so he was a very young man to have the success come to him. All of his best plays, now actually I should qualify that, but some people would call the plays that he wrote before 1910 as his best plays, and they're all written before he's 30. Anyway, Joseph Holloway on his curtain call, he says, he came forward and shyly bowed, returning hurriedly, as if scared by the sight of the audience. And then he goes on, Colum is a strange lad, and always looks to me as if a good square meal would do him a world of good. A slight, fragile scrap of humanity with the look of a startled fawn ever hovering about his eyes. Now, in keeping with that, let's have another picture of Colum. This is a photograph of him when about the time he wrote the play, The Land. Not the best photograph, but it gives a certain sense of him. Another commentator, W.P. Ryan, made a comment on what it was like and how startling it could be to meet Colum on the streets of Dublin. This would be a little later, around 1910, I think, 1912. So he says that Colum seems, even as a country boy who has just seen the city for the first time, but who is shyly and pathetically anxious to run away from it. A deer that has strayed into O'Connell Street or Grafton Street could not be more bewildered or more anxious to escape to the hills. He always looked gently and poetically incongruous in Dublin, and always in the act of taking a last look at it and a hurrying farewell to it. Well, he did take a farewell to it in 1914 when he came to America, but he plunged right into Manhattan, so if he had a fear of cities, he got over it, or he learned to live with it. This is a sketch made by John Butler Yeats, the father of the poet W.B. Yeats. I mentioned that I'm neglecting the latter part of Collins's career. There is another interesting story about Collins taking his play Balloon to a producer, hoping to get it produced. And this, I think, is in the early 40s, perhaps. And the producer looked at it and said, well, I don't know, one way or the other. But in any case, I think we'll have to change the name. Collins said, oh, my friends think that Balloon is a very good name for this play. And the producer said, no, I don't mean the name of the play. I mean the name of the writer, because there was another writer named Padraig Colum at the beginning of the century, and I think we just couldn't get away with calling you by the same name. He said, but that's me. I don't think the producer believed him. Okay, I would like to just put on one more picture of Colum, which is a sketch by Willie Pogani. Colum's profile was compared with Dante, the great Italian poet. I think I'll put him this way. But on the other hand, I've heard Colum himself, or I've read him compare James Joyce to Dante. So maybe it was the thing to do at this time, to compare people to Dante. In any case, Willie Pogani was an illustrator who illustrated very finely a number of Colum's children's books. What I would like to do is to propose some connections between a few kinds of these very diverse works. I refer in my title to the drama of storytelling because I think that what Colum thought of as typical of drama and what he thought of as typical of storytelling as it exists among the people, that is, the telling of folk tales, these are surprisingly similar. First of all, there's a kind of speech that brings to life characters by putting them into situations to which they must respond, dramatic speech, and the voice of the storyteller. But secondly, most strikingly, there's the emphasis on action. Excuse me. Drama, but also folktale-based fiction, and in Colum's poetry, dramatic monologue, suited him because he did not want to express himself in his work in a direct way, but to express, or as he says, to make articulate the country people. In the drama, he could make them act and speak, but this instinct carried through into other works as well. Ultimately, perhaps, the model for Colum's artistic expression may be the storyteller he heard as a boy. Colum had some interesting comments both about drama and storytelling, and they point out the similarity in the way he looked at the two of them. Writing in 1906, he had this to say about what he saw as the typically Irish, but also perhaps his own personal aptitude for drama. This is an article called Ibsen in the National Drama. He said, there is in Ireland a great feeling for character, not character as the modern novelists conceive it, mere psychological material, but for character living, breathing, moving, in a word, acting. Now, when we think about this, characters in plays, with some notable exceptions, do not generally reveal their complex psychological states through direct speech. They don't ramble on about how they're feeling. They might mention it from time to time. And they usually don't speak to the audience directly. And they don't engage in long soliloquies. Again, as I say, there are some notable exceptions. Instead, or in the main, their natures, their conflicts, their fears and dreams are expressed through external things, how they look, what they touch, how they react, what objects they hold, and what they do. To be made perceptible to the audience, aspects of their inner lives have to be put into concrete external terms. Thus, the old fiddler in Collins's play, The Fiddler's House, Con Hurricane, whose instinct is to leave the settled life that his two daughters love and to roam the roads as a musician again, is constantly reaching for his fiddle or going into the bedroom to get his fiddle. The call of the road and of the wandering life of music is represented by the fiddle tune that creeps in or floats in through the window and over the half door. And Khan's eventual decision, which is to resume his vagrant life, is foreshadowed by the number of times within the play that he grabs his fiddle and goes out the door. And that is a way of rendering his dream to us in concrete terms. Now, Collins's practice and belief here are very close to what he saw in traditional folk tales. The folk tale, Collins tells us, has primarily to do with happenings rather than states of mind. And the folklorist Max Lucy also backs him up here and gives a useful example. The folk tale doesn't tell us that the third son, for instance, is compassionate and truthful. It doesn't comment directly on his character's qualities, but rather it shows him as he shares his bread with a beggar and kindly gives him the information he seeks, whereas the older brothers keep their cake for themselves and answer the old man's question with derision and lies. You know, the folk tales that start that way. There are three brothers and so on. But okay, so this is a kind of externalization which the drama and the fiction have, or these kinds of stories have in common. In these folk tales, the characters are represented more through their actions than through long, complex reveries or interior monologues, and that is certainly true of Collins's characters in his books as well, his fictional characters. Collins's fictional characters, no more than his stage personalities, meditate on their predicaments or ramble on about their messy emotions. Their speech tends, too, to be the compressed utterance that itself kind of represents or comes from their mental and emotional states or conflicts, rather than directly expresses those. Collins is able to do this in his fiction because his fiction, whether it is for children and young adults or whether it is novels and short stories for grown-up people, is almost always constructed out of Irish folk tales. We can thus note that these connections between the way folk tales and drama work make folk tales a very appropriate form for Collins, who had these other concerns as well, given the very many differences, of course, between the two kinds of material. In fact, for Collins, as he's working folk tales into his children's works and his novels, he often has to alter them to push them more towards states of mind and more towards the expression of personal complexities, because when we read novelistic works, we need some of that. But nevertheless, the externalization to some extent remains. This then is close to what I mean by the title for tonight's talk when I refer to the drama of storytelling. But in addition, Collins over and over again called attention not only to folk tales and to their applicability to Irish peasant life, but also to the way in which they were presented, to the fact of storytelling. Book after book is presented as a story, or a group of stories being told. And within them, characters tell more and more stories to each other, sometimes because a quest that they are on requires that they search for a story, sometimes to soothe the mind of someone who is disturbed, and sometimes, often and often, as we often hear, just to pass the time. Collins had a lot to say about the excitement that came to a small group of listeners as a storyteller began his stories beside the fire, while night drew a curtain of silence over the cottage and the countryside alike. And now, George, if we could just dim the lights and get that peat fire glowing at the front of the hall here to get the right mood. Here's what Collins says about the storyteller he heard. The storyteller whom I listened to when I was young had many advantages over the storyteller in one of our public libraries. He told his stories in the evening. He told them by the light of a candle and a peat fire, often by the light of a peat fire only. There were shadows upon the walls around. Nothing that he told us had to be visualized in the glare of day or by the flare of electric light. He was free to make all sorts of rhymes and chimes in the language he used, and to use words that were meaningless, except for the overtones of meaning that were in their sounds. And his audience was small, no more than a score of people, and so he could be intimate in voice and manner. He had few gestures, this particular storyteller. Sometimes he beat his hands together. Sometimes he raised a stick that was by him to give solemnity to some happening. And outside was the silence of the night and the silence of a countryside. This, for Collin, then, is another aspect of the drama of storytelling, the sense of excitement, the stirring of the imagination, as the skillful storyteller makes present the characters of his stories and their actions. This drama is not the drama of histrionics. The storyteller of his youth did not have to wave his arms around or act out the actions of the characters. He didn't mime them. Rather, it was the drama of the voice speaking these stories and making them memorable. The drama of events not represented physically as on the stage, but made present imaginatively through the vehicle of words. This is the care for the good word of a woman in one of Collin's short stories who tells about her past very effectively. And it is also what occurs in the introduction to a chapter in Collin's 1923 novel, Castle Conquer, in which certain characters tell over events in their community, and he introduces them like this. Beside the fire they sat, and their voices, though low, had a vibrant quality, for they were speaking not of everyday things, but of a drama that was well remembered. Excuse me. I can't think of a full-length fictional work of Collin's of any level that does not make use of folktales in one way or another. And that includes his two novels, The Castle Conquer and The Flying Swans, which make very interesting use of folktales, taking them a long way from their use in some of his children's works. But I would like to spend the rest of the time this evening talking a little bit about some examples of what Collin did with the drama of storytelling in his most engaging and brilliant children's book, The King of Ireland's Son. This book is a sophisticated and technically imaginative intertwining of folktales, parts of folktales, altered folktales, and occasionally invented material that Collin creates to look like folktales. The subtle way in which Collin cuts and trims his tales so that in the end they unexpectedly all fit together to form one complex whole is one of the most inventive and delightful features of the book. And he does this in a number of ways. Sometimes he superimposes characters in surprising ways. The stupid lad in one of the stories turns out to be the lost prince of another. The girl who is silently knitting shirts to break the spell that has transformed her 7 brothers into wild geese turns out to be the cross stepmother of another tale. At last, we discover that the stories that we thought were separate were really the beginnings, the middles, and the endings of each other. I think that this makes them rather like the loops and curves of the Irish interlaced design that Dr. O'Grady showed us some beautiful examples of a few weeks ago. In a similar way, they beguile the eye with the impression of multiplicity, all the curves and loops of the design and of the plot. But at the same time, they carry with them the conviction of unity, which in the end you realize. So the King of Ireland's Son is constructed not just out of stories, but out of the telling of stories. So many of the book's characters themselves have stories to tell that the sound of storytelling murmurs continually behind the action. And the only characters in the book who do not tell stories are the villains. Many of the stories are worked into the book as amusements, although they often carry overtones or convey bits of information that are relevant to the main story. For instance, when the king's son and his true love, Fidelma, are returning from the book's first set of adventures, they shorten the road, which carries them across a field of blue flowers and a field of white flowers and another field of blue flowers, and so on, by telling each other stories. And it seems to be, and this is very important for Collins, necessary to have stories to tell, necessary to be able to participate in this amusement. Now, I have, let's see. I think we have time to read one of these examples. I copied some of Pogani's illustrations. This first picture is from the little story called The Ass and the Seal, which is, of course, as you can maybe guess, an animal story, which is very peculiar. The seal thinks that the world of men is wonderful. He knows them. He's heard their music when they're out in their boats. But the ass is not nearly so impressed. And then I'm going to read you the story of the young cuckoo, which is not very long. It'll take about 5 minutes to read. Excuse me, again. Yet again. Now, this is a story that I think has political overtones. This book was published in 1916. And Collin was very, very involved in the political upheaval of the time, but he published the book in America, so he was not involved directly in the events of the Easter Rising in 1916. But he was an intimate friend of many of the people who were, and many of the people who were executed. Now, the problem with saying that this story has political overtones is that I can't quite figure out how they work. So I'll read it to you, and maybe later on you can tell me how you think they work. And even if we can't work them out, I think the story itself is bizarre enough to be entertaining on its own. In a way, it's not a typical example of Collin, but in another way, I think it's very successful. The story of the young cuckoo. The young cuckoo made desperate attempts to get himself through the narrow opening in the hollow tree. He screamed when he failed to get through. His foster parents had remained so long beside him that they were wasted and sad, while the other birds, their broods reared, were vigorous and joyful. They heard the one that had been reared in their nest, the young cuckoo, scream, but this time they did not fly toward him. The young cuckoo screamed again, but there was something in that scream that reminded the foster parents of hawks. They flew away. They were miserable in their flight, these birds, for they knew they were committing a treason. They had built their nest in a hollow tree that had a little opening. A cuckoo laid her egg on the ground, and carrying it in her beak, had placed it in the nest. Their own young had been pushed out. They had worn themselves to get provision for the terrible and fascinating creature who had remained in their nest. When the time came for him to make his flight, he could not get his body through the little opening. Yesterday, he had begun to try. The two foster parents flew to him again and again with food, but now their own nesting place had become strange to them. They would never go near it again. The young cuckoo was forsaken. A woodpecker ran around the tree. He looked into the hollow and saw the big bird crumpled up. "Hello," said the woodpecker. "How did you get here?" "Born here," said the young cuckoo sulkily. "Oh, were you?" said the woodpecker, and he ran around the tree again. When he came back to the opening, the young cuckoo was standing up with his mouth open. "Feed me," said he. I've got to rush around frightfully to get something for myself," said the woodpecker. "At least someone ought to bring me food," said the young cuckoo. "How is that?" said the woodpecker. "Well, oughtn't they to?" said the young cuckoo. "I wouldn't say so," said the woodpecker. You have to use your wits, haven't you? He ran round the trunk of the tree again and devoured a lean grub. The young cuckoo struggled at the opening and screamed again. Don't be drawing too much attention to yourself, advised the woodpecker when he came to the opening again. They might take you for a young hawk, you know. Who might? Said the cuckoo. The neighbors. They would pull a young hawk to pieces. What am I to do? Said the young cuckoo. What's in your nature to do? My nature, said the young cuckoo. It's my nature to swing myself on branches high up in a tree. It's my nature to spread out my wings and fly over pleasant places. It's my nature to be alone, but not alone as here, alone with the sound of my own voice. Suddenly he cried, cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo. I know you now, said the woodpecker. There's going to be a storm, he said. Trust a woodpecker to know that. The young cuckoo strove toward the big sky again, and he screamed so viciously that a rat that had just come out of the ditch fastened his eyes on him. That creature looked bad to the young cuckoo. Rain flopped on the leaves. Thunder crashed. A bolt struck the tree, and the part above the opening was torn away. The young cuckoo flung himself out on the grass and went awkwardly among the bluebells. What a world, said he. All this wet and fire and noise to get me out of the nest. What a world. The young cuckoo was free, and these were the first words he said when he went into the world. And what that means, I don't know. But what we do see is that Colum is certainly very attentive to the ways in which birds work, or the ways in which they behave. He has a book called The Boy Who Knew What the Birds Said, so maybe this also applies to he himself. Now, unfortunately, what happens next in the story of the King of Ireland's son in Fidelma is that the king's son falls asleep in one of the fields of blue flowers. It isn't really his fault. He's been enchanted. But when he wakes up, Fidelma has been gone, and some mean old enchanter has left some notes behind, written in and he's getting disturbed because the tribute of preserved mice and so on that usually comes from places like Ireland hasn't been coming. So he decides that he's going to go and see about it himself. And here we see him, he's already jumped from the cliff to the boat. And now he's jumping from this boat to another boat. And from there he's going to jump to the Giant's Causeway and see what's happening to his subjects, the cats of Ireland. So in these cases, the stories are used in this book to while away the time, maybe to suggest something that nobody can figure out, then maybe not. Or if they're used to calm somebody down. And I do think this story has overtones that we can work out. Storytelling is also at the very heart of the King of Ireland's Son. And it's at the heart of the book in the form of the unique tale, which is the object of not one but two quests. The first hero, the King of Ireland's son himself, has to find the unique tale if he's going to rescue Fidelma. His quest is, well, he has a sort of light, but he gets it dirty. And in order to clean it, he's got to find the unique tale and also what came before its beginning and what comes after its ending. So it's a complex task. But this book has two heroes. And the second one, the one who seemed stupid at the beginning, the homelier hero, known at first as Gilly of the Goatskin, he must tell the tale in order to receive a name. This already gives us a sense of the tremendous importance that is given to the idea of storytelling in this book. Two heroes have to undergo arduous tasks simply in order to share the tale, and it's no easy task getting to the one to tell it and the other one to hear it. First of all, they've got to count some horns And when they get up to the number, they forget it because there's a swan going overhead telling tales. So it's a tricky business. And it should give something of a sense of the importance of the stories here. But also, we should note that telling the tale allows one of them, Gilly, to gain a sense of identity. And that is very important for Colum's sense of the way in which the Irish culture and the Irish identity are bonded together. Another thing about the unique tale to know is that it is a reworking of an authentic folktale that many of you may know, but it is itself about silence and speech. This is a story that begins with a young girl whose brothers are transformed into geese when she's born. It's because of something her parents said, which doesn't seem to me altogether fair, but that's how folktales go. In any case, when she learns of their plight, she resolves to take upon herself the difficult task of breaking the spell. One of the brothers tells her what she must do. It's a long and a tiresome labor we would put on you. If you would gather the light down that grows on the bogs with your own hands, and if you spun that down into threads, and wove the threads into a cloth, and sewed the cloth into a shirt, and did that over and over again until you had made 7 shirts for us, all that time, without laughing or crying or saying a word, you could save us. And each of these shirts takes a year to make. In the usual folktale version of the tale, the girl does manage to complete her task, but she has a few problems. She's accused of some crime and condemned to burn at the stake, but she's sewing all the while, and just as the flames are beginning to mount, she puts in the last stitch. The brothers come down, they're transformed, they fight off all the people who are the villains, and they rescue their sister. Something similar begins to happen to Sheen, who is the heroine here, but it doesn't end up quite in the same way. What happens to Sheen is she loses a child, and she's suspected of murder. The child is beside her, she's asleep, and a wolf steals the child away and leaves blood around her. When the king, her husband, sees that in spite of this horrible thing that's happened, the only thing she does is to keep stitching at this last shirt that she's working on, and that she still won't say anything to him and doesn't even cry, he hardens his heart against her and banishes her from the castle. And this is what happened. She knew she was being sent from the house he had brought her to. A bitter cry came from her. Then the stitched cloth that was in her hand became bogged down and was blown away on the breeze. When she saw this happen, she turned from the king's castle and ran through the woods crying and crying. She's unable to complete the task, even though she decides to try it again. But when the first thread was spun and the memory of her child blew against her heart, she cried tears down once again. And then the thread that she had spun became bogged down and was blown away. So she has to give up on rescuing her brothers and finding out what happens to her child. And she has to commit the fates of all of them to destiny. And she hears a prophecy that someday the one who comes to love her son, wherever he may be, will somehow sacrifice to redeem her brothers. So this story brings a note of despair into the tale, which is not typical of folk tales. And it's interesting because this is one of the ways in which Colum uses the folk tales but deepens them or changes them to present a different mood and sometimes a different rhythm, I think. Also, this tale is about silence. It is about a character who is forbidden to speak and reinforces maybe our notion of the value of communication because she does not have it. And finally, since the character who tells the tale is the very one who most needs to hear it, the story is also interesting from this angle. Gilly of the Goatskin, who tells the tale, is in fact Sheen's long-lost child. And eventually he finds out that the unique tale that he tells is in fact his own tale. And by the way, Sheen also turns out to be the stepmother, the unsympathetic stepmother, but now we know she had some excuse, of the King of Ireland's son. So this is one of the ways in which all these tales are blended together. Because Gilly earns a name and an identity by telling and also hearing the tale, this tale-telling episode represents for Colum the necessity of preserving folk art, oral communication, if the Irish people, he thought in his day, were to preserve a sense of their own identity. Colum does not forget to include the reader in the storytelling situation here. For he has a fiction from the outset of the book, it comes in just a few times, that the story is not a story being read, but rather that it is being told. So he will make little references to who it's being told to, my kind foster child. And we don't know anything about who the narrator might be or anything more about who the listener is, but it brings us into this world, and it also makes more intimate the communication that's going on in the same way that beside the fire, as Colum told us in the passage I quoted earlier, there was an intimacy between the audience and the storyteller. This storytelling frame comes in for the last time at the beginning of the final section of the book called The Spey Woman, and this is also a nice picture. The Spey Woman is the prophecy woman, and it's the Spey Woman who is also the fosterer at various times of many of the characters in the book. So she's one of the unifying forces. And at the beginning of this section opens like this: "There are many things to tell you still, my kind foster child, but little time have I to tell you then, for the barnacle geese are flying over the house, and when they have all flown by, I shall have no more to say." I think this gives a nice urgency to the sense of the story which is about to come together. And it also strikes me that this is appropriate for this moment in my lecture as well. Perhaps the barnacle geese are flying over the Irish Society Hall. There are many things to tell you, but I'll be done sometime. The very end of the book escorts the two heroes, the King of Ireland's son and Gilly of the Goatskin, who's now known as Flan, since he's a true prince and has to have a name. It takes them into the realm of traditional stories. Our story becomes associated with the traditional bodies of stories. And I'd like to also to put this up. These are the way the story ends. Now, just before this, all the characters have gotten married. You know, folk tales always end with weddings. And when you have so many folk tales as there are in this book, ending together, we have more than one wedding, or more than one couple, and we have a very grand and long wedding scene, which takes the traditional form of the story in being formulaic, very colorful, but very rhythmical as well. And then there's this passage. "The King of Ireland lived long, but he died while his sons were in their strong manhood. And after he passed away, the island of destiny came under the equal rule of the two. And one had rule over the courts and cities, the harbors and the military encampments. And the other had rule over the waste places and the villages and the roads where masterless men walked. And the deeds of one are in the histories the Shawnishees have written in the language of the learned, and the deeds of the other are in the stories the people tell to you and to me." Now that would be Gilly, and notice that Colum identifies himself as the homelier of the two heroes. "When I crossed the ford, they were turning the mountain path. When I stood on the stepping stones, they were traveling the road of glass." The ending then of this book recalls again the man whose stories first gave Colum the impetus for the King of Ireland's son and the storytelling situation, and recalls as well the end of the four-piece to the poet circuit that we looked at earlier. The storyteller whom Colum heard, he reminds us, was seated on a roughly made chair on a clay floor, and he did not look histrionic. what was in his face showed that he was ready to respond to and make articulate the rhythm of the night. He was a storyteller because he was attuned to this rhythm and had in his memory the often repeated incidents that would fit it. A rhythm that was compulsive, fitted to daily tasks, waned, and a rhythm that was acquiescent, fitted to wishes, took its place. This is the drama of storytelling for Colum, and it is this that he worked into his own fiction. In The King of Ireland's Son, I think Colum did much more than cleverly interweave and imaginatively rework the folk tales that he had heard in his grandmother's house and the folk tales that he heard and read later. He further fitted their magnificent and wonderful events to the people who heard them, who, although their ancient Irish heritage might make them figuratively king's sons, were in practical circumstances much more like the plain-spun and bumbling second hero, Gilly of the Goatskin. In the background as well are the political and cultural mix of the time. The need and thirst for stories in The King of Ireland's Son among all the characters corresponds to the need and thirst for the myths and folk tales of the past that would tell Irish of Colum's time who they had been and who they might be, giving them, if not a name, then, like Gilly of the Goatskin, an identity. In this amalgamation of hero tales and humbler fireside tales, of the characters in the stories and the audience of those stories, Colum certainly finds in the drama of storytelling a homely grandeur.
Question on something that's personal, like where was he born, and was he married, and why did he move to America?
Well, actually, George, I'm glad you asked that question because I couldn't get it into the talk within an hour, and now that we're in question and answers, we have time to talk about it. He was born, and he loved to say this, he was born in the Longford workhouse in the Midlands of Ireland. But then he always felt compelled to qualify that by pointing out that his father was the master of the workhouse, but not a pauper. So it was not quite as colorful as people might at first think. When Colum was 6, his father went off to America, and the family went to the countryside to stay with Colum's mother's family. This is where Colum, I think, first got his feeling for the real country life. And then his father came back unsuccessful from America. His father did not appear to have a lucky star. Colum said his father was the only man he ever met who managed to cross America twice and not find a job. So when Colum's father came back, they moved to Sandy Cove, and his father had a clerk job and gradually lost that. And then Colum, as I mentioned earlier, moved to Dublin to try to help support the family. His mother had died. He married Mary Catherine Gunning Maguire, known as Molly, which was a lot simpler than all the rest, who was a well-educated and somewhat fiery temperament. She had gone to school with James Joyce and studied modern languages with James Joyce, and she was a writer herself who wrote one beautiful memoir, Life in the Dream it's called, and also a book of criticism. And they went to America because they couldn't afford to live in Dublin anymore. Colum had been able to leave his job when I think it was a wealthy American actually came up with a bursary for him that lasted for around 5 years. But when that was over and they were newly married, he couldn't make ends meet. And he decided to go to America because an aunt had sent him passage money, and he thought he was just going for a visit, like many people. But, of course, this was just at the outbreak of World War I, and the move became permanent, though he did a lot of traveling and revisiting of Ireland after that. But he didn't, that time, he left Ireland in 1914 and didn't come back for a visit until 1922. And that, of course, there were some very striking events that occurred in those times, and it was very disturbing to Colin, I think.
If not, then on your behalf and on my behalf, I'd like to thank Dr. Bis20 for the very interesting lecture she presented here tonight. I'm somewhat familiar with some of Father Colin's work, but just a small sample, just enough to make me want to read some more. And I hope as well that that's one of the results of your lecture here tonight, that perhaps you could have the folks out scouring the university library for some of these works. I'm sure there are some in the university library, and I'm sure that there's quite a good collection of an Irish collection at our local university, so thank you for that. So once again, thank you very much, Dr. Bis20, and we hope to see her back later on in this lecture series as part of the postponed readings from Irish literature segment that we put on every year. So look forward, and we haven't set a date for that yet, but we shall. Once again, thank you very much. A couple of promos. First, next week's lecture, we turn from looking at Ireland and Irish literature in the larger context, and we turn our attentions closer to home, where we'll be speaking learning about an individual from the Irish community here at PEI, Premier William Wilfrid Sullivan, and Professor Fred Driscoll of the Department of History at the University of PEI will be presenting an overview of that gentleman's life next month night. I must say, he's a gentleman that I know very little about, but in a sense that's not surprising, because you're not going to find too much about it in our local school system. I will probably learn more at next week's lecture than anything I've been able to accumulate at the present time. And I hope you'll come along and learn something about Premier Sullivan and his accomplishment. I understand that he was Premier during a fairly important period in our history, the transition period, the period of reform. Certainly, PEI had just shortly before joined the Federation, so there was a lot of new things happening, and it was a very key period of time when he was Premier of this province. So do come along and be part of that. The other thing I want to say before we break for some tea and coffee and sandwiches is that we are going to have a banquet here on St. Patrick's Day, Wednesday, March the 17th. And if any of you have an interest in attending that, we do have tickets here tonight. Our guest speaker on this occasion, we're being very ecumenical, and we're inviting the very famous Scotsman Jim McNeil of Eastern Graphic fame to be present as our guest speaker, and he's graciously accepted to do that. And I think he's going to use the opportunity to educate all the Irish in one way or another. So if you would like to be part of that, tickets are available here tonight. You can talk to me and we'll take it from there. I don't think there is anything left by way of advertising or promotion. So unless someone has a last-minute question on anything in general.
Mention the artist, like George.
Good point. Yes, an added feature of our St. Patrick's Day or Week celebration will happen this coming Sunday. Two local artists, Andrea Redmond and Dale McNevin, have graciously agreed to be part of the celebration this year, and they will be displaying some of their work. Andrea, in this case, her paintings, and Dale McNevin is a very well-known and increasingly well-known illustrator. They both do excellent work. I'm more familiar with Andrea Redmond in the sense that I know that she paints. A lot of the work is influenced by Irish and Celtic themes. And so I suspect Dale McNevin would also fit in that category. So what we're going to do is we're going to be taking down these pictures of all these illustrious past presidents of the Netherlands Irish Society, and Wolf Tone and Padre Pierce, and even St. Patrick himself, for at least 1 week, starting this Sunday, and we're going to hang Andrea's paintings and Dale's illustrations wherever we can around this building, and we'll have them up for at least a week. The official opening will be this Sunday at 3 o'clock, and anybody and everyone is invited to come and be part of that, and particularly yourself. Okay, thanks for reminding me of that now. And let's break now, and feel free to come up and talk to Dr. Devine or socialize and see
Well, I'm the made a presentation of the unlike so many of us kids as we get older,
he was even more productive. It was the same year as what he started. But I think it was he began to put things together, something fun. And maybe to be a little bit older,
That's what I can't think of it. I don't know. There's something going on over here.
And I would wasn't some agency that made it
Well, I can't think of any better way to celebrate Easter Monday. What? How do you think we get a crowd on Easter?
Not